They're the ones who never seem bothered, the ones who don't flinch when others lash out, who don't chase after explanations, who meet chaos with stillness and rejection with silence. To most people, they seem cold, detached, or even arrogant. But what if I told you that this nonchalance, this emotional quiet, is not a personality trait? When someone appears unbothered by things that would devastate most people like disrespect, abandonment, betrayal, it's not always because they don't care. It's often because they once cared too much and were met with punishment for it. In psychological terms, nonchalance can be a form of dissociation, a subconscious withdrawal from emotional intensity as a way to avoid being hurt again. Many people who move through life with an air of emotional distance once lived in an environment where expressing vulnerability was dangerous. Maybe they cried out for love and were ignored. Maybe they asked for understanding and were mocked. Maybe every emotional opening was met with exploitation. So, over time, they learned to mask their feelings, not to be manipulative or mysterious, but to survive. This kind of survival becomes second nature. The nonchalant person starts to anticipate betrayal before it happens. They grow skilled at hiding their expectations so they can't be disappointed. They avoid emotionally charged conversations because their nervous system still associates those moments with danger. What looks like indifference is often deeply buried fear. The psychology behind this is rooted in early conditioning. A child who is shamed for crying learns to stifle their tears. A teen who opens up and gets laughed at learns to suppress their inner world. Eventually, emotional self-containment becomes armor. They become masters at acting like nothing gets to them, not because they don't feel, but because feeling never felt safe. And there's something else. Nonchalant people are rarely given the benefit of the doubt. When they withdraw, others assume they're uncaring. When they don't chase after someone, they're accused of being cold. But what if that silence is actually exhaustion? What if it's the product of years spent explaining themselves to people who only used that explanation as leverage? A nonchalant person may have once begged someone to stay, just once, and that person turned it into power. So now they never beg again. Not because they wouldn't love deeply, but because begging made them feel small, humiliated, powerless. The irony is, some of the most loyal and loving people in the world are also the most emotionally withdrawn. They felt love in a way so raw and pure, it broke them when it wasn't returned. So now they protect that love by hiding it, like something too sacred to offer freely. You see, silence isn't always a lack of emotion. Sometimes it's where emotion goes when it hasn't felt safe in a long time, when they don't react the way you think they should. It's not because they don't feel, it's because they've trained themselves to avoid reactions, a survival tactic, because reacting in the past brought backlash or ridicule or abandonment. And now their nervous system has learned, feel quietly or not at all. This can make relationships with nonchalant people difficult. You might feel like they don't care, that you're not getting through to them. But the truth is, you probably are getting through. They just won't show it, because in their world, showing it once led to being hurt. That's the cruel trick of emotional trauma. Teaches people to become what looks like emotionally unavailable, when in reality, they are just emotionally self-contained, not cold, not detached, just hidden behind learned calm, behind emotional numbness, behind silence that once protected them from an unsafe world. And they're not unreachable, but you can't force your way in. You can't expect them to be vulnerable on command. For someone like this, emotional expression isn't casual, it's a risk. And they will only open that door for someone who makes them feel safe. Not safe through words alone, but through consistency, empathy, and time. Because they've heard "I won't hurt you" before. It's not the promise that builds trust, it's the follow-through. It's not the passion in your voice, it's the absence of cruelty in your silence. Nonchalant people aren't mysterious because they want to be. They're mysterious because they've had to become private to survive. Privacy is power when the world has made vulnerability feel like a weapon used against you. And deep down, many of them want to connect. They crave it. They just don't know how to bridge that gap without feeling like they replacing a loaded gun in someone else's hands, the gun of knowing what they care about, what hurts them, what they fear losing. When you see someone who doesn't get excited easily, who doesn't overshare, who doesn't demand your attention, it's easy to think they're emotionally simple. But often, they are the opposite. Their inner world is incredibly complex, but sealed off. Not because they want to be alone, but because they've been punished too many times for trying to belong. We rarely think about what it costs a person to seem like they don't care. What if every time they showed they cared in the past, it made things worse? What if they were mocked for their sensitivity? What if they were taken advantage of every time they got close? That kind of emotional history creates a split in the psyche divide between what they feel and what they show. To protect themselves, they become actors in their own lives, playing a role of apathy when, internally, they're screaming with emotion. This disconnect isn't always conscious. Some nonchalant people don't even know they're doing it. It becomes who they are. They no longer remember who they were before the mask. But it always starts with pain, with moments that told them, don't feel too much, don't show too much, don't need too much, or you'll get hurt again. But what about their relationships? This is where the nonchalant demeanor becomes most misunderstood. Friends, lovers, even family often misread their stillness as apathy. But the nonchalant person, in many cases, is operating with heightened sensitivity. They are scanning constantly, not for connection, but for betrayal. Not because they are cynical by nature, but because their blueprint of love has been shaped by the wreckage of past experiences. They learn to love cautiously. They know better than to show all their cards. They know what it feels like to be ridiculed for vulnerability or punished for asking for too much. So they give in limited doses. They express care in indirect ways, checking in randomly, doing acts of service, or simply not disappearing. They may never say "I miss you," but if they still answer your call, they probably do. Psychologically, this is a form of trauma-induced boundary creation. Instead of saying "I'm hurt," they say nothing and move on. Instead of expressing disappointment, they shrink their expectations. It's not that they've given up on others, it's that they've grown weary of being the only one fighting for understanding in a room where they never felt safe enough to speak. This often leads to the internalization of a message that says, "I'm too much when I'm vulnerable. I'm safer when I'm quiet." And so begins the silent contract they sign with themselves. Never ask for too much. Never expose the soft parts. Never let anyone know you care too deeply, because history has shown them that openness was the weapon others used to hurt them. They grow up in environments where emotional expression was either mocked, invalidated, or met with emotional abandonment. Perhaps their parents said things like, "Stop crying, it's not that serious," or "Don't be so sensitive." These messages root themselves in the subconscious and become the emotional scaffolding for adulthood. They teach the child that emotions are dangerous, embarrassing, or unwanted. So, the child becomes emotionally self-contained and the adult becomes emotionally misunderstood. As adults, nonchalant people are often perceived as cold, indifferent, or uncaring in romantic relationships. But what's really happening is this. They are navigating the battlefield of emotional intimacy with 1,000 invisible wounds. Every time they consider opening up, their body recalls the last time it backfired. Their nervous system flinches before their heart can even speak. This isn't just a metaphor. Studies in affective neuroscience show that emotional pain activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain, meaning that memory of being humiliated for expressing love or being ghosted after sharing vulnerability actually registers as pain in the body. So, the nonchalant person isn't choosing distance. They are responding to emotional injury the same way you'd guard a broken rib. Ironically, they often end up in relationships with people who crave validation and emotional availability. The partner might interpret the nonchalant person's coolness as lack of interest or emotional neglect. But in truth, the nonchalant individual is wrestling silently with the urge to connect and the fear of being shattered by that connection. This creates a dynamic that reinforces their worst fear. No one understands me, because when they try to protect themselves by being reserved, it pushes others away. And when others leave, it confirms their belief that vulnerability is dangerous. So, they retreat further. They become quieter, colder, harder to read, and slowly, they disappear behind the mask they built to protect themselves from disappearing in the first place. But underneath all that silence, there's often an overactive mind, a chaotic inner world, and an aching desire to feel safe enough to be seen. They just don't believe anyone will stay once they are. And that belief wasn't born in adulthood, it's the legacy of a childhood where emotional needs went unmet. You'll notice these individuals are often extremely independent, not just by choice, but by survival. They don't ask for help because help wasn't reliable when they needed it most. They don't share emotions because no one knew what to do with them before. Their silence is the sound of 100 emotional emergencies they survived alone. And perhaps the most tragic part is this: they are often the most loyal, the most consistent, the most introspective people you'll ever meet if you learn how to sit quietly with them long enough. But most people won't. Most people want fireworks, declarations, immediate affirmations. And the nonchalant person, they love in whispers, in glances, in presence. If you don't know how to read the silence, you'll miss the depth. So how does one connect with a nonchalant person? Not by demanding they reveal themselves, not by shaming them for being distant or to chill, but by being safe, by being patient, by proving through consistency that their vulnerability won't be used as ammunition. They need to see that emotions can exist without chaos, that love can exist without volatility, that opening up doesn't always lead to abandonment. Because the truth is, nonchalant people aren't emotionally absent, they're emotionally bruised, and they're waiting for a reason to believe that this time it's different. In many ways, their silence is the loudest proof of how deeply they feel. You just have to be willing to listen to what isn't being said, to understand that silence is not emptiness, it's evidence, it's history, it's protection, and maybe, just maybe, their stillness isn't a lack of passion, but the most courageous way they know how to love after surviving what tried to make them stop. Because when someone has been hurt to the core, their greatest fear isn't that love doesn't exist, it's that it will come, only to leave when they finally believe in it. That's why the nonchalant person watches closely and speaks carefully. They've learned that not everyone deserves access to their depth. Not everyone knows what to do with someone who feels everything but shows almost nothing, but the ones who do, the ones who understand the language of silence and the power of safety. They'll find that behind the walls and beneath the calm lies one of the most loyal, most emotionally intelligent, and most profoundly loving souls they'll ever meet. They were never cold, they were cautious, and they were waiting not for attention, but for someone who wouldn't mistake their silence for emptiness, but recognize it as a quiet storm of survival, healing, and hope.